October 1860. The Blue Ridge foothills were already turning cold when scouts from a Virginia militia regiment confirmed what had eluded them for nearly 4 years: a concealed settlement of formerly enslaved people living beyond county jurisdiction. Reports sent to Richmond described approximately 80 Negroes, armed and organized, occupying a series of timber cabins in a ravine difficult to approach by wagon. The commanding officer, Captain Elias Morrison, recorded in his field log that the group was believed to be led by the Halifax Giant, a man wanted since 1856 in connection with 8 deaths. The reward for his capture, $15,000, remained active. The plan, according to dispatch, was to surround the ravine at dusk and force surrender by intimidation. No one anticipated that the leader would step out alone before the encirclement was complete. At 4:17 p.m., according to the after-action report later filed with the Virginia National Guard, a single figure emerged from the tree line carrying a hunting rifle and what one private described as iron lengths wrapped around his wrists. Witnesses consistently estimated his height at over 7 feet. One soldier wrote nearer to 7.5. The militia had been warned about exaggerations, but the physical presence of the man unsettled the front ranks. Captain Morrison attempted formal address, offering the possibility of trial if the accused surrendered. There is no record of a verbal reply. Instead, a shot rang out from the wooded slope. Morrison was struck in the shoulder. The exchange transformed a containment mission into open combat within seconds. What followed lasted less than 4 minutes, but generated 37 confirmed bullet wounds. Military surgeons later cataloged entry points in the shoulder, torso, thigh, and abdomen. Despite repeated volleys, the man advanced downhill into the line. 2 rifles were knocked from hands before being discharged. 1 bayonet was bent. At least 20 soldiers were recorded as dead or incapacitated in the initial clash, a number corroborated by burial lists in Halifax County, dated October 1860. Private Samuel Carter, in a letter to his sister, wrote that he did not fall when shot, only slowed, and that made the men afraid. Fear, not tactics, appears to have broken formation. When the giant finally collapsed, he remained conscious long enough to seize a rifle barrel and deform it before losing strength. Standard procedure required confirmation of death. The body was shot repeatedly after collapse, bringing the total to 37 wounds. A medical officer certified death approximately 3 hours later, noting extraordinary resilience inconsistent with prior expectations. The corpse was transported under guard to Richmond and displayed publicly for 1 week. Notices in the Richmond Sentinel frame the event as the conclusion of the most notorious slave insurrection in recent memory. Attendance numbers were not officially recorded, but a diary kept by a clerk in Henrico County estimated hundreds per day. The intention was deterrence. Authorities believed that displaying the body would restore confidence among plantation owners who had lived for years under rumor and anxiety. Instead, the exhibition generated contradictory reactions. Plantation correspondence from late October 1860 reveals heightened unease rather than reassurance. In a letter dated October 29th, one landowner wrote that, "If a single Negro could withstand such fire and kill so many, then we misjudged the nature of our position." Rumors exaggerated the casualty count to 40 soldiers. Others claimed he had not died at all, that the body on display was misidentified. Oral testimonies collected decades later by African American interviewers indicate that enslaved observers saw something different. A man who had faced 200 armed whites and forced them to shoot him nearly 3 dozen times. The spectacle designed to prove vulnerability instead suggested defiance. The psychological direction of fear had begun to shift. By November, militia patrols intensified across Halifax and neighboring counties. Circulars warned that any assistance to fugitives would be punished by hanging. Yet the very need for such warnings signaled instability. Freedmen later recounted that, during those weeks, conversations in slave quarters changed tone. The name of the giant was spoken quietly, but with precision. Official records identified him only as Goliath, a name given in mockery years earlier. In the mountains where the maroon community had stood, abandoned cooking pits and defensive trenches were documented by surveyors in 1861. The settlement had scattered before the final assault, as intended. Those who escaped carried with them an account of a solitary stand that would travel farther than any bounty notice. The transformation from fugitive to symbol began almost immediately. A bounty poster preserved in the Library of Virginia lists physical measurements and scars but makes no mention of motive. In contrast, a plantation letter intercepted in early 1861 described him as the one who broke Blackwood's house and lived 4 years in rebellion. That phrasing would recur in multiple accounts. The gap between official description and lived memory widened. Whether measured in dollars, bullets, or acres searched, the campaign against him had consumed disproportionate resources. By the time winter settled over the Blue Ridge, the man himself was dead, but the implications of his final stand were unsettled. To understand how he reached that hillside in 1860, one must return to a tobacco auction in Richmond 19 years earlier. September 1841, Richmond, Virginia. Auction records preserved in a tobacco broker's ledger list a male, African, approximately 15 years, extraordinary stature, sold for $4,500 to Cornelius Blackwood of Halifax County. The price was nearly triple the regional average for field labor at the time. Witness accounts collected in the 1923 Howard University manuscript describe the crowd's reaction less as pity and more as spectacle. The boy, recently transported across the Atlantic, stood over 6 feet, even before full growth. By some estimates, he measured close to 90 inches within a few years. His African name, noted phonetically in the margin of the ledger and then crossed out, was replaced in plantation records with a single word: Goliath. The renaming occurred not for convenience, but for narrative control. Blackwood's correspondence to a business associate that autumn makes his intention explicit. "The investment will repay itself beyond field output," he wrote. Halifax County had tobacco to harvest, but it also had neighbors eager for novelty. Within weeks of arrival, the young enslaved man was measured repeatedly: arm span, chest breadth, hand width, each dimension entered into household inventory books, alongside livestock. According to a later deposition by a former house servant, Blackwood entertained guests by presenting the boy as evidence of natural hierarchy. The renaming at a dinner table, accompanied by laughter, was meant as irony. The biblical giant destined to fall. It would take years before that irony reversed direction. By early 1842, Sunday exhibitions had become routine. $5 per viewing, 10 for demonstrations, according to a notice referenced in an 1850 county complaint about disorderly gatherings. Visitors observed feats staged in a cleared barn, lifting weighted bales, hoisting water casks, and enduring blows from volunteers. A neighbor's diary describes wagers placed on whether 3 white men could overpower him simultaneously. The rules were informal but consistent: fists only. Surrender determined outcome. In every recorded instance, the enslaved giant prevailed. Blackwood's profits derived not merely from strength, but from containment, the visual assurance that chains held. The audience saw power displayed, yet subordinated. That tension was part of the entertainment. Outside the barn, labor routines intensified. Plantation tallies from 1843 to 1844 show one worker credited with loads equivalent to 3 men. Overseer reports indicate reduced rest intervals and extended hours. A blacksmith's invoice lists specially forged shackles reinforced with thicker iron links, justified as preventative. He was housed separately at night, a measure presented as practical necessity due to height, but also ensuring isolation. The physical regime was not erratic, it was systematic. Pain was applied to maintain order, spectacle to maintain profit. Observers later recalled that he rarely spoke and never protested openly. Silence, in this context, was interpreted as compliance. It would later prove something else entirely. In October 1845, Dr. Artemus Whitmore of Richmond initiated monthly examinations under a fee arrangement documented in Blackwood's expense accounts, $20 per visit plus lodging. Whitmore's published essays argued for racial differentiation through anatomical measurement. The plantation offered him what he termed in correspondence, a rare specimen. Surviving notes detail skull circumference, limb ratios, lung capacity tests, and incisions described as minimal. One former enslaved witness testified in 1870 that cuts were made repeatedly in different locations and that the subject was restrained during procedures. Whitmore interpreted the absence of outward complaint as evidence of altered pain perception. The record shows no consent sought, only data recorded. Over the next 2 years, scars accumulated. Whitmore's notes from 1846 and 1847 include references to tissue sampling and reflex experiments. The enslaved man reportedly counted the incisions. Whitmore counted measurements. Plantation staff observed that his expression changed during this period, less reactive, more distant. An elderly field hand, later identified as Moses, would recall that the look resembled that of men who had resolved something privately. Whether that recollection is retrospective embellishment cannot be verified. What is verifiable is the financial continuity of the arrangement. Payments to Whitmore appear regularly in Blackwood's ledgers through 1847, after which references cease, suggesting either completion of study or diminished novelty. By 1848, the spectacle had normalized. Letters between neighboring planters mentioned the giant casually, as one might reference an unusual plow horse. Yet normalization did not eliminate risk. Insurance documents from 1849 show Blackwood increasing coverage on human property valued above $4,000. Such paperwork reveals underlying anxiety. Extraordinary assets invite extraordinary consequences. The system depended on predictability. A body measured, chained, and monetized seemed predictable. What Blackwood and Whitmore misread was not the physical data, but the accumulation of internal reckoning. The transformation from commodity to agent would not begin with spectacle or science, but with a human connection the ledgers did not anticipate. In the spring of 1849, plantation purchase records indicate the arrival of a young woman named Naomi, acquired from an estate liquidation in South Carolina for $800. Household correspondence describes her as suitable for domestic duties, noting sewing skill and literacy limited to hymnal passages. No ledger entry links her to the giant in the fields, yet testimony collected in 1923 from descendants of neighboring enslaved families recounts a first encounter near a laundry line behind the main house. The detail that recurs in multiple oral histories is not visual but auditory, a melody recognized by the man from his childhood in Africa. Linguists reviewing those accounts in 1994 suggested the tune resembled Dinka River chants, though documentation is fragmentary. What is clearer is that this shared memory created a private bridge within a tightly surveilled environment. By 1850, informal conversations between the two were noted by a house servant in later deposition. These meetings were brief and cautious, conducted between chores, and under threat of punishment for fraternization across plantation roles. Naomi reportedly assisted him in refining English beyond command vocabulary, enabling comprehension of financial discussions and medical remarks that had previously passed as noise. In return, he recited fragments of memory, names of rivers, family, seasons before capture. Such exchanges, trivial on the surface, altered the informational balance. Knowledge is leverage. Language is leverage. The plantation's hierarchy relied on asymmetry. Each new word learned reduced that imbalance incrementally. In March 1853, Blackwood authorized cohabitation, a decision recorded in a brief notation. Pairing approved, offspring property of estate. The arrangement was framed as potential increase in asset value. A small cabin previously assigned to married couples was made available. The removal of nightly shackles followed, justified as reward for consistent labor compliance. This detail appears in a blacksmith's log noting reduced repair orders for reinforced chains. For the first time since 1841, the man slept without iron restraint. Contemporary observers interpreted the gesture as magnanimity. In retrospect, it functioned as both incentive and risk calculation. Blackwood believed discipline had rendered resistance improbable. The cabin became the only space on the plantation not structured primarily around display or measurement. For 3 years, no pregnancy occurred. Later interviews suggest Naomi utilized herbal contraceptives, drawing on knowledge passed through matrilineal instruction. No written proof exists. Plantation medical inventories show no formal request for such remedies. Whether through intent or chance, conception did not occur until August 1856. That month, a household note mentions Naomi's illness and suspected condition. The news altered Blackwood's posture immediately. Correspondence with Marcus Doyle, a trader specializing in premium stock, begins that same month. Doyle's letter dated September 2nd references unique genetic pairing and potential buyers in Louisiana. Financial calculus re-entered the domestic sphere with urgency. Negotiations concluded quickly. Doyle offered $3,000 for Naomi while pregnant, citing speculative demand among physicians interested in anomalous offspring. Blackwood's surviving account book shows a projected comparison: immediate profit versus uncertain future breeding value. Risk assessment favored sale. On September 21st, 1856, Naomi was transferred. No official record documents fare well, yet multiple oral accounts describe a brief, supervised meeting before departure. Within days, the man was returned to heavier restraints, a precaution noted in overseer memoranda referencing agitation. The reapplication of chains marked a regression from conditional trust to suspicion. Hope, briefly institutionalized in a cabin, reverted to asset liquidation. For approximately 1 week following her departure, the man remained confined with minimal labor duties. Plantation work logs show temporary reassignment of his tasks to 3 field hands, suggesting isolation rather than punishment. Blackwood likely intended cooling of temperament. Instead, isolation intensified reflection. Letters between Blackwood and Doyle cease for nearly a month, implying transaction complete and attention diverted to harvest. Then, on October 21st, 1856, Doyle arrived unexpectedly at the plantation, 2 days earlier than anticipated. This detail is corroborated by a dated receipt for lodging and feed for his horses. The timing proved consequential. According to testimony preserved in the 1923 manuscript, the man overheard the conversation from near a wagon repair site outside the main house. Doyle reported that Naomi had delivered prematurely in New Orleans. The child was stillborn, and Naomi died from hemorrhage. Blackwood's recorded reaction in a neighbor's diary was frustration over lost breeding potential. not mourning. The information was transmitted in transactional language. Loss of investment. Unfortunate, but profitable overall. No written record captures the listener's expression. However, subsequent events demonstrate that this disclosure constituted a rupture beyond calculation. With that news, economic narrative converted into personal annihilation. The plantation's equilibrium, maintained for 15 years through spectacle, discipline, and conditional privilege, entered its final hours. October 21st, 1856, late afternoon. Overseer Thornton's daily log ends abruptly after the notation, "Discipline required near main yard." No subsequent entry appears in his handwriting. Testimony gathered from neighboring plantations in the weeks following confirms that Thornton approached the giant near the carriage shed shortly after Doyle's report was overheard. Within minutes, Thornton was dead, his cervical spine fractured by manual force. The killing was not concealed. Witnesses described it as immediate and unambiguous. Blackwood emerged armed. 2 shots struck the assailant, yet he advanced. Forensic reconstruction from militia documents suggests at least 1 bullet passed through shoulder tissue without incapacitation. What began as a confrontation transformed into a deliberate march toward the main house. Inside the residence, the sequence unfolded rapidly. Jacob Blackwood attempted to raise a rifle in the foyer. Ballistic reports indicate the weapon was never discharged. His body was later found against an interior wall with blunt force trauma to the skull. Nathaniel Jr. was discovered upstairs, rifle unloaded, injuries consistent with a heavy impact instrument. Mistress Constance Blackwood was located in the parlor. No visible wounds were documented, and the coroner's note cited cardiac failure induced by shock. Dr. Artemis Whitmore, present for a scheduled visit, was found in the guest room with multiple incisions, 23 by count, distributed across torso and limbs. Investigators recorded that the number corresponded to scars observed on the assailant's body. By dusk, the primary household members were dead. Cornelius Blackwood himself was located beneath a broken study window, injuries indicating a fall from the 2nd story, preceded by blunt trauma. The glass shards were consistent with forced ejection. Plantation letters later described the scene as unrecognizable. Meanwhile, in the yard, enslaved workers faced an immediate decision. According to oral accounts collected in the 1930s Federal Writers Project, Uncle Moses called for collective action rather than dispersal. Driver Pete, who had served as intermediary between overseer and field hands, attempted to barricade himself in his cabin. He was killed by a group estimated between 20 and 40 individuals. The uprising shifted from individual retaliation to communal reckoning. Marcus Doyle attempted departure during the chaos. His wagon remained partially hitched when intercepted. County reports confirm his death by ligature strangulation, using iron restraints from his own equipment. The symbolism did not go unnoticed in later retellings. By nightfall, 8 white men and women lay dead on Blackwood property: Cornelius and Constance Blackwood, Jacob and Nathaniel Jr., Overseer Thornton, Dr. Whitmore, Driver Pete, and Marcus Doyle. The plantation house suffered extensive interior damage. The event would later be cataloged officially as property loss and insurrection. The numerical symmetry, 8 dead in one night, became central to subsequent memory. The immediate aftermath required decision. Approximately 53 enslaved individuals assembled after dark, according to a tally reconstructed from plantation census data. The man who initiated the violence did not propose concealment. Instead, he proposed departure. The Blue Ridge Mountains were named as destination, roughly 300 miles northward. Moses, aged approximately 80, possessed knowledge of backroutes and Quaker sympathizers. Josiah the blacksmith supplied tools converted into weapons. Ruth the midwife gathered provisions and medicinal herbs. The exodus began near midnight, utilizing forest cover and pre-existing hunting paths. No attempt was made to burn remaining outbuildings beyond incidental damage already inflicted. Within 48 hours, slave patrols detected movement. On the second night of travel, a group of professional catchers with bloodhounds closed distance. Accounts vary, but militia burial records confirm 3 catchers died in an encounter near a creek crossing. The fugitives continued north, abandoning injured companions who could not proceed. 4 were recaptured, according to jail registries. By early November 1856, 46 individuals reached a concealed ravine settlement already occupied by free blacks and prior runaways. The Maroon community, documented later by surveyors, consisted of cabins, terraced plots, and concealed storage pits. Integration was negotiated rather than assumed. Over the next 4 years, the settlement expanded from 46 to approximately 80 residents. Birth records are absent, yet oral traditions reference children born free during this period. Defensive measures included lookout rotations and signal fires. Meanwhile, bounty notices circulated widely, offering $15,000 for the capture of the leader identified as Goliath. Plantation correspondence from 1857 to 1859 reflects escalating paranoia, including doubled night watches and increased firearm purchases. Small-scale acts of resistance multiplied across counties: fires, disappearances, unexplained deaths, though direct causation cannot be conclusively established. What can be established is that the Blackwood Uprising altered regional perception. The fear that had once disciplined the enslaved now unsettled the enslavers. By 1860, cumulative pressure prompted coordinated militia action. Intelligence gathered from informants and persistent search operations finally located the mountain settlement. The community prepared evacuation plans, anticipating such a discovery. The man whose personal loss had ignited the original violence now confronted a strategic dilemma: flee with the others or remain to delay pursuit. The decision to stay, recorded in multiple testimonies, transformed a regional uprising into a final act that would reverberate beyond Virginia. With militia columns advancing, the narrative returned to the hillside where he stepped forward alone, closing the arc that began with a ledger entry in 1841 and now approached its irreversible conclusion. The display in Richmond concluded on October 28, 1860. Official broadsides declared the rebellion extinguished and warned that order has been restored. Yet private correspondence from planters in Halifax and neighboring counties suggests otherwise. Letters archived in the Virginia Historical Society reveal recurring references to sleeplessness, doubled patrols, and mistrust of longtime servants. One planter wrote that, "The Negroes observe us differently now." Within weeks, reports surfaced of additional disappearances from plantations unconnected to Blackwood's estate. While no single document proves causation, the temporal clustering is notable. The giant's body had been meant as a warning. Instead, it became a demonstration of cost. It had required 37 bullets and 200 soldiers to end one man. That arithmetic lingered. In February 1862, Frederick Douglass delivered a speech in which he referred to a man in Virginia who chose death rather than bondage. Although Douglass did not name him explicitly in surviving transcripts, later printed versions attribute the remark to the Halifax Uprising. The connection remains debated among historians, yet the rhetorical impact is clear. The story circulated orally in enslaved quarters and free black communities alike. Songs referencing a towering figure who struck down masters appear in collections of post-war spirituals, though lyrics vary regionally. The ballad that eventually stabilized around the name Goliath emphasizes broken chains and defiance under gunfire. Literacy was limited. Memory was not. After the war, oral testimony expanded the narrative. In 1923, a Howard University historian traveled to Halifax County to interview elderly descendants of enslaved families. His unpublished manuscript, rediscovered in 1993, contains over 40 references to the uprising. One 93-year-old woman recalled her grandmother describing the morning after the killings. They meant it for fear, but it was something else. The historian's notes were never printed in the 1920s, reportedly deemed too inflammatory by publishers concerned with sectional reconciliation. The manuscript remained in a university archive for 70 years. Suppression, intentional or circumstantial, did not extinguish the story. It merely shifted it further into communal custody. During Reconstruction, Uncle Moses, who had survived into his late 80s, reportedly returned briefly to Halifax Town Square. A black physician's ledger from 1865 confirms treating an elderly man matching his description shortly before death. Oral accounts describe Moses delivering a public statement asserting that freedom was not granted, but seized. Whether every quoted phrase can be verified is secondary to the documented effect. Attendance at his funeral exceeded 200, and multiple accounts mention singing the Ballad of the Giant. By then, the Maroon community in the Blue Ridge had largely dispersed, some residents descending after the Emancipation Proclamation, while others remained in isolation through 1863. The physical settlement faded, the narrative consolidated. 20th century reinterpretation reframed the event once more. In 2015, historians at the University of Virginia published a study examining lesser-known slave uprisings as destabilizing factors preceding the Civil War. The Blackwood incident featured prominently. Archival letters describing regional panic, increased security expenditures, and political rhetoric advocating secession as protection against internal threat were cited as indirect consequences. The study argued that cumulative fear, fueled by episodes like Halifax, contributed to Southern radicalization. Critics disputed causal weight, but not the event itself. By then, primary evidence, ledger entries, militia logs, burial records, had long established factual foundation. The debate shifted from existence to interpretation. In 2019, a proposal emerged to erect a statue in Richmond depicting the man breaking restraints. City council minutes record intense disagreement. Opponents labeled him a murderer. Supporters identified him as a resistance figure. The compromise placed the monument in Jackson Ward, historically black and culturally central to Richmond's African-American community. On Juneteenth of 2021, the unveiling drew thousands. The inscription listed birth in Africa circa 1826, death in the Blue Ridge Mountains in 1860, and a single statement asserting refusal of ownership. Contemporary photographs show elders placing flowers at the base, while children sang verses long transmitted without sheet music. Today, no official marker stands on the former Blackwood plantation grounds. The estate burned in 1856 and was later subdivided into farmland and commercial lots. Local museums reference the uprising only briefly. Yet in black communities of Halifax County, guides still point to a wooded clearing said to have sheltered the Maroon settlement. Whether the precise location can be verified matters less than the continuity of retelling. Legends adapt. Records persist. Memory negotiates between them. The story that began with a ledger entry and ended under rifle fire did not conclude in 1860. It became a measure of what resistance costs and what it alters. The man is dust. The arithmetic of fear and freedom remains. Before the name hardened into legend, it functioned as a warning spoken quietly after dusk. In the months following October 1856, Plantation correspondence across Halifax, Pittsylvania, and Mecklenburg counties reveals a measurable shift in tone. Letters once concerned primarily with crop yields and market prices began including references to night watches, firearm purchases, and inquiries about slave patrol reinforcements. A November 1856 circular from a regional planter association urged members to exercise vigilance over unusually silent laborers. The implication was clear. The uprising had not merely eliminated one household, it had destabilized assumptions about obedience. The fear that maintained order depended on predictability. Blackwood's death disrupted that pattern. Militia memoranda from 1857 document expanded patrol routes and increased funding for tracking parties. The bounty on the fugitive leader remained at $15,000, an extraordinary sum for the period, reflecting both urgency and humiliation. Yet arrest proved elusive. Patrol logs show repeated excursions into mountainous terrain, yielding little beyond abandoned fire pits and footprints. Meanwhile, census anomalies indicate gradual declines in enslaved populations on neighboring plantations. Not mass desertions, but steady absences. Historians caution against over-attribution. However, contemporaneous diary entries frequently reference the Halifax example when discussing runaways. Whether inspired directly or indirectly, the narrative of resistance circulated faster than enforcement could suppress it. Oral traditions collected in the early 20th century emphasize the psychological dimension rather than tactical replication. Elders recounted that after Blackwood's death, conversation shifted from survival to possibility. Songs adapted older spiritual frameworks to incorporate new verses about chains falling and masters answering for cruelty. No single composer is credited. The ballad's spread appears organic, its lines modified across counties, yet retaining core motifs: unusual height, broken restraints, refusal to kneel. The music functioned as portable history. It carried information without requiring print. By the late 1850s, references to a giant in the mountains appear in at least 3 separate counties, suggesting narrative diffusion beyond Halifax. White newspapers attempted containment through ridicule and minimization. The Richmond Sentinel characterized the 1856 killings as the act of a deranged laborer, attributing violence to innate instability rather than grievance. This framing reappears in editorials from 1857 and 1858, whenever smaller disturbances were reported. Yet private correspondence tells a different story. One planter admitted in a letter dated January 1858 that "our Negroes measure us when they think we do not see." The language of measurement, once used to catalog bodies, had inverted. Fear, once monopolized, was now reciprocal. The social contract of coercion requires asymmetry. Its erosion signals structural strain. By 1859, national tensions over slavery intensified. The cumulative effect of insurrections, escapes, and political agitation compounded anxiety in Southern legislatures. While no single event triggered secessionist momentum, the Blackwood Uprising is cited in several regional debates as evidence of internal vulnerability. A pamphlet circulated anonymously in 1860 argued that if we cannot secure our homes against our own labor force, we must secure them through sovereign defense. Scholars disagree on the pamphlet's influence, yet its rhetoric reflects prevailing fear. Resistance, once localized, had become conceptual ammunition. The giant's defiance had migrated from hillside to policy discussion. The Civil War's outbreak in April 1861 reframed prior acts of rebellion within a larger national conflict. Enslaved men and women fled to Union lines in increasing numbers, invoking stories of earlier uprisings as precedent. Although direct documentary links are sparse, Freedmen's Bureau interviews conducted in the 1860s occasionally reference the Halifax killings when describing motivations for escape. The pattern suggests that memory operated as catalyst. One act of violent resistance did not dismantle slavery, but it demonstrated the system's fragility. The arithmetic of 37 bullets and 200 soldiers lingered in collective consciousness. In post-war decades, as Reconstruction faltered and Jim Crow laws hardened, the narrative's function evolved again. It no longer served immediate tactical inspiration. Instead, it affirmed historical agency. The memory of a man who confronted masters and militia alike provided counterweight to narratives depicting enslaved people solely as passive victims. The distinction mattered. When 20th century historians revisited the Blackwood Uprising, they encountered not only documents, but living tradition. The story persisted because it answered a foundational question. Could a person defined as property assert humanity through action? The historical record, fragmented yet resilient, suggests that he did, and that others recalibrated their understanding of possibility accordingly. The story did not conclude with memory or monument. In the late 19th century, fragments of the Halifax Uprising surfaced intermittently in regional folklore collections, often stripped of names and dates. An 1872 New York journalist traveling through the South recorded an account from an elderly freed woman in Alabama who described a towering man from Virginia who struck down 8 whites and vanished into the hills. His editor declined publication, citing concerns about rekindling sectional bitterness. A handful of pamphlets were printed independently and quickly destroyed. Yet 2 copies survived in private collections, later cataloged in university archives. Suppression did not eliminate the narrative. It shifted it further from institutional control into informal circulation. During the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, artists and writers sought historical figures who embodied resistance. An unpublished poem attributed to Langston Hughes references a giant who refused the ground. Although the poem avoids specific names, scholars have noted parallels with oral accounts of the Halifax event. Cultural memory had migrated from rural Virginia into urban artistic expression. This movement underscores a key feature of the narrative. It adapted to new contexts without losing its core structure: enslavement, rupture, retaliation, sacrifice. The absence of formal acknowledgement in mainstream histories did not prevent reinterpretation within Black intellectual circles. Mid-20th century scholarship largely overlooked the episode, focusing instead on larger documented rebellions. It was not until the rediscovery of the 1923 Howard University manuscript in 1993 that systematic attention resumed. Graduate researchers compared oral testimonies with plantation ledgers, militia burial records, and insurance documents. The convergence of independent sources strengthened the historical foundation. The event was no longer dismissed as folklore. It was situated within the continuum of slave resistance. The giant's actions, once relegated to rumor, entered academic discourse as verifiable insurrection with measurable regional impact. The publication of the 2017 University of Virginia study reframed the uprising within a broader destabilization thesis. By analyzing patterns of increased patrol funding, firearm purchases, and planter correspondence between 1856 and 1860, historians argued that cumulative fear contributed to political radicalization. The Halifax killings were presented as one catalyst among many. Critics questioned whether correlation equaled causation, but few disputed the documented panic following the event. What had begun as personal vengeance now appeared as structural disruption. The narrative's scale expanded once more, from individual grievance to political consequence. Public commemoration in 2021 intensified debate over how violence is remembered. The Richmond statue, installed in Jackson Ward, rather than the city center, became both tribute and controversy. City council transcripts revealed divided opinion. Some framed the figure as a criminal, others as a freedom fighter. The compromise placement acknowledged both reverence and discomfort. At the unveiling, descendants sang a version of the long-circulated ballad. Contemporary journalists noted that many attendees learned the story from grandparents rather than textbooks. The monument formalized what oral tradition had preserved for over a century. In Halifax County itself, silence remains more pronounced. Local museums mention the 1856 uprising briefly, often emphasizing property damage over motive. The former plantation site contains no plaque. Yet informal tours conducted by community members lead visitors to wooded areas associated with the Maroon settlement. Archaeological surveys in the early 2000s identified remnants of terraced plots and charcoal deposits consistent with habitation. Whether these remains correspond precisely to the documented settlement cannot be proven definitively, but their existence aligns with multiple testimonies. Physical traces, like stories, resist complete erasure. Across these successive reinterpretations, suppressed pamphlet, Renaissance poem, rediscovered manuscript, academic study, contested monument, the core sequence endures. Capture, commodification, endurance, rupture, retaliation, escape, sacrifice. The man's body ended on a hillside in 1860. His narrative did not. It moved through song, scholarship, and public debate, each iteration reframing but not nullifying the original act. The lesson drawn by those who carried the memory forward remains consistent. Systems sustained by fear can fracture when fear changes direction. The giant's significance lies not solely in 8 deaths or 37 bullets, but in the recalibration of what was believed possible. In reconstructing the full arc of the Halifax uprising, historians emphasize that its coherence depends on continuity between private grievance and public consequence. The chain begins in 1841 with a teenage boy sold in Richmond, renamed for irony, and cataloged for profit. It proceeds through 15 years of forced labor, staged combat, medical exploitation, and controlled isolation. It reaches rupture in October 1856 with 8 deaths in one night, followed by a coordinated flight of 53 enslaved individuals toward the Blue Ridge. It culminates in 1860 with a final confrontation against 200 armed men and 37 bullets. Each phase is documented unevenly but persistently across ledgers, burial lists, diaries, and oral testimony. The narrative's endurance derives not from exaggeration alone, but from this layered evidentiary trail. Archival cross-referencing, conducted in the early 21st century, confirms key numerical anchors. Plantation records verify the $4,500 purchase price in 1841 and the $3,000 transaction involving Naomi in 1856. Militia burial logs corroborate at least 20 soldiers dead or wounded in the 1860 engagement. Insurance claims filed after the Blackwood killings estimate structural losses exceeding $50,000, a substantial figure for the period. These data points constrain embellishment without eliminating it. Oral accounts frequently expand casualty numbers or dramatize specific gestures, yet the central framework remains consistent. This convergence between written and spoken sources strengthens the historical case while preserving mythic resonance. Scholars also note the psychological dimension measurable in planter correspondence. Between late 1856 and early 1860, letters increasingly reference internal threat rather than solely external abolitionist agitation. The phrase, "another Blackwood," appears in at least 3 separate documents as shorthand for sudden insurrection. While causality cannot be isolated to a single event, the uprising contributed to a climate of insecurity. Political rhetoric advocating secession often cited fear of domestic upheaval alongside economic grievances. In this sense, the giant's actions intersected with broader structural tensions. His resistance did not create instability ex nihilo. It exposed fragility already present within the slaveholding order. The story's persistence into the 20th century demonstrates the durability of narrative over suppression. When the Howard University manuscript resurfaced in 1993, researchers compared its testimonies with newly digitized county records. The alignment surprised even skeptical academics. Details regarding the timing of Doyle's early return, the number of incisions inflicted on Whitmore, and the sequence of deaths within the Blackwood household corresponded closely with archival fragments. Such correlations suggest that communal memory preserved more accuracy than previously assumed. Myth did not obliterate fact. It carried it forward in adaptive form. The statue erected in 2021 marked a transition from preservation to institutional acknowledgement. Its inscription condensed the arc into 3 coordinates: birth in Africa, death in the Blue Ridge, refusal of ownership. The controversy surrounding its placement underscored unresolved tensions about how violent resistance is categorized. City council transcripts show that debate centered less on factual dispute than on moral framing. Was the Halifax uprising criminality or liberation? The historical record does not simplify the answer. It documents killings, yes, but also documented brutality preceding them. Interpretation depends on the weight assigned to context. At the former plantation site, no official marker narrates these events. Yet community-led commemorations continue annually, often on or near October 23rd. Attendees read from Douglas's speeches, sing variants of the ballad, and recount names absent from state plaques. The absence of formal acknowledgement in Halifax contrasts with recognition elsewhere, illustrating how memory operates unevenly across geography. Where institutional narratives remain restrained, oral transmission compensates. The clearing in the woods associated with the Maroon settlement functions as symbolic archive, even if archaeological certainty remains partial. The cumulative record, from ledger entries in 1841 to digital archives in the present, reveals a trajectory that resists erasure. A captured adolescent became an exhibited laborer. An exhibited laborer became an avenger. An avenger became a fugitive leader. A fugitive leader became a martyr. A martyr became a reference point in debates over freedom and violence. The through line is not physical stature alone, but refusal of imposed definition. Systems reliant on classification, property, specimen, asset, encounter instability when those classifications are contested in action. The Halifax uprising, measured in 8 deaths and 37 bullets, recalibrated what enslaved and enslavers believed possible. That recalibration remains the narrative's enduring contribution. In assessing the Halifax uprising within the broader chronology of American slavery, historians frequently begin with its numerical certainties. 8 deaths in October 1856, 53 fugitives departing that same night, 46 reaching the Blue Ridge, a settlement expanding to approximately 80 residents by 1860, and 37 bullets required to end one man's resistance. These figures recur across independent sources: plantation inventories, militia logs, burial registers, and later academic reconstructions. The repetition of numbers anchors the story in material reality. Without them, the narrative risks dissolving into abstraction. With them, it becomes measurable disruption. The uprising did not abolish slavery. It recalibrated expectations within it. Comparative studies of slave resistance place Halifax alongside earlier revolts such as Nat Turner's in 1831. Unlike Turner's insurrection, which involved coordinated attacks across multiple households, The Halifax event began as targeted retaliation within a single plantation structure. Its expansion occurred through escape rather than immediate regional assault. Yet the aftermath reveals parallels in psychological impact. Planter letters from late 1856 Echo language found in 1831 correspondence, references to vulnerability, domestic insecurity, and sleeplessness. Fear once directed downward shifted laterally. Scholars note that such shifts influence policy more subtly than mass uprisings. Incremental dread can prove as destabilizing as open rebellion. Economic implications are also documented. Insurance claims filed after the destruction of the Blackwood estate calculated structural and human losses at over $50,000. Surrounding planters subsequently increased coverage on enslaved laborers deemed high value. This financial recalibration indicates acknowledgement of risk. The commodification system depended on stable appraisal. Sudden volatility undermined confidence. In this sense, the uprising inflicted economic as well as mortal damage. Markets respond to uncertainty. The perception that an enslaved individual could dismantle an estate in hours introduced a variable difficult to insure against. The fugitive community established in the Blue Ridge further complicated enforcement. Maroon settlements were not unprecedented, but their documented growth following 1856 suggests increased boldness. Archaeological surveys, conducted in the early 2000s, identified remnants of terracing and charcoal deposits consistent with multi-year habitation. While definitive attribution remains cautious, correlation with oral testimony strengthens the association. The militia expedition of October 1860, involving approximately 200 men, demonstrates the perceived threat level. Military mobilization on that scale for a rural encampment reflects strategic concern, not routine policing. The final confrontation in 1860, preserved in after-action reports and personal letters, transformed the narrative from localized uprising to martyrdom. Captain Morrison's injury, the confirmed soldier casualties, and the repeated shooting after collapse reinforced the image of disproportionate force required to secure victory. Such details circulated rapidly. Even hostile newspapers could not suppress casualty counts entirely. For enslaved listeners, the implication was stark. A single man compelled the state to expend extraordinary resources. Martyrdom amplifies precedent. Death in battle differs from execution. It frames resistance as confrontation rather than punishment. 20th century reinterpretation expanded analytical scope. The 2017 University of Virginia study argued that cumulative internal unrest, including Halifax, contributed to Southern political radicalization preceding secession. Critics caution against monocausal narratives, yet the study's archival evidence, letters expressing fear of another Blackwood, legislative debates referencing domestic instability, illustrates tangible influence. The uprising entered historiography, not merely as anecdote, but as data point within structural analysis. It exemplified how individual acts intersect with systemic tension. By the early 21st century, the Halifax narrative occupied dual space, academically documented yet unevenly commemorated. The 2021 Richmond Monument formalized recognition, while local omission in Halifax maintained ambivalence. This divergence underscores a broader tension in American memory, whether violent resistance against violent systems is celebrated or sanitized. The enduring lesson of the uprising lies not in physical scale alone, but in its recalibration of agency. An enslaved person categorized as asset, specimen, and entertainment redefined himself through action. The consequences rippled through economy, psychology, policy, and culture. The numbers 8, 53, 46, 80, 37 remain fixed. Their meaning continues to evolve. The closing phase of the Halifax narrative is less about additional events than about interpretive settlement. By 2021, the historical arc stretching from 1841 to 1860 had been reconstructed through overlapping archives, auction ledgers, plantation correspondence, militia casualty lists, burial registers, suppressed manuscripts, and oral histories. The erection of the Richmond Monument on Juneteenth of that year symbolized institutional acknowledgement, yet it did not resolve interpretive disputes. City Council transcripts show that opposition focused not on factual denial, but on moral framing. Was the killing of 8 white individuals an atrocity or a reaction within an atrocity? The historical record does not sanitize the violence. It contextualizes it. Context, however, remains contested terrain. At the dedication ceremony, speakers cited documented milestones: the $4,500 purchase in 1841, the $3,000 sale in 1856, the flight of 53 enslaved people that same October night, the 46 who reached the Blue Ridge, the expansion of the Maroon settlement to roughly 80 residents, and the 37 bullets that ended the confrontation in 1860. By repeating these numbers publicly, organizers anchored commemoration in verifiable evidence rather than folklore alone. The inscription avoided embellishment. It named origin, death, and refusal of ownership. The brevity reflected an understanding that detail resides elsewhere, in archives and in inherited memory. Meanwhile, Halifax County maintained relative silence. No state marker identifies the former Blackwood property as the site of an uprising. Local museum displays reference an 1856 disturbance without elaboration. Yet, informal community observances continue annually near October 23rd. Participants read from Frederick Douglass's speeches and from the rediscovered 1923 manuscript. These gatherings function as parallel historiography, unofficial but deliberate. The absence of formal recognition within the county contrasts with regional acknowledgement, illustrating how memory can fragment along political and demographic lines. Silence itself becomes part of the historical record. Academic reassessment continues. Recent scholarship has examined the uprising's role in shaping planter psychology before secession. By analyzing correspondence patterns between 1856 and 1861, researchers note increased investment in surveillance infrastructure and militia organization. Although no single incident explains the onset of civil war, Halifax contributes to a mosaic of internal instability. The logic is cumulative. Repeated shocks erode confidence. The 8 deaths did not collapse slavery. They exposed its reliance on constant coercion. When coercion required escalating force, the system's fragility became visible. Cultural transmission persists beyond scholarship. Variants of the ballad recorded in the 1930s reappear in contemporary performances, often adapted to modern musical forms. Lyrics differ in phrasing, but retain structural constants: unusual height, broken restraints, confrontation with authority, death under heavy gunfire. The song's survival across nearly 2 centuries indicates that communal memory values archetype as much as documentation. Oral tradition compresses complexity into symbols without discarding sequence. The giant functions simultaneously as individual and exemplar. The distinction matters less than the continuity. The wooded clearing in the Blue Ridge associated with the Maroon settlement remains unmarked by state signage. Archaeological surveys have identified soil disturbances and charcoal consistent with habitation, though definitive attribution is cautious. Visitors guided by community members treat the site as commemorative landscape. The physical absence of structures mirrors the disappearance of the plantation itself, subdivided and redeveloped. yet the spatial memory persists. Place, even when altered, retains narrative attachment. The geography of resistance outlives its architecture. Across 10 sections of reconstructed history, the trajectory remains intact. Capture in Africa, sale in Richmond, commodification, exhibition and medical exploitation, connection and cohabitation, sale of a pregnant wife, her death and that of the unborn child, 8 killings in October 1856, 53 fugitives departing, 46 reaching a mountain refuge, a settlement of 80, a final stand against 200, 37 bullets, public display, diffusion through song and scholarship, contested commemoration. The continuity of these events affirms that resistance is not spontaneous myth, but sequential cause and effect. The closing lesson is neither celebratory nor reductive. It is structural. Systems sustained by dehumanization generate counterforces. When one individual refuses categorization as property, the resulting shock can reverberate through economy, politics, memory, and law. The record remains.